And today we're looking at what I guess for many people, many students at Edinburgh, would be the biggest objection, the objection that stops all further investigation into the claims of Jesus. And that is the idea that science, the modern science, the progress of science, has made faith in Christianity, faith in God in general, the supernatural, anything like that has made that completely irrational. Has made it, if not laughable, then certainly nothing that a thinking person could sign up to. This is how Stephen Hawking puts it. There is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. And he goes on to say, science will win because it works. And we know that Hawking is right, don't we? Science does work. There are all sorts of ways that we can point to today to see that science really does work. From the electronic devices we've all got in our pockets, whether it's our iPod or our phone or whatever, to the way in which science has enabled us to build new things, has made advancements in medical science. I remember 19 months ago my son was born, and I remember thinking at the time how glad I was that he was being born in the 21st century and not the 18th century. I think my wife was even more glad. That there was all the pain relief, there was the monitoring of his health that meant that if anything went wrong, the doctors could react. All sorts of ways that made my son's birth a pretty safe experience, if not quite painless. So we see all around us that science works. And Hawking says that shows that eventually, as time goes on, science is going to completely kind of dominate the field, and all kind of religious explanations are going to be done away with. This is what another atheist, the philosopher Christopher Hitchens, the journalist Christopher Hitchens, who died a couple of years ago, says. He says this: religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. So he's saying everything that we need to know, everything that requires explanation, the microscope and the telescope, scientific method can explain it. So therefore we no longer need religion. We can put religion, including Christianity, to one side and dismiss it. And I guess for many of us that will be our approach this lunchtime. But what I want to look with you in the time that we have remaining is whether or not that claim that Stephen Hawking made, that Christopher Hitchens made, that others like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Daniel Dennis and others as well, does that claim actually stand up to scrutiny? Is this claim that science renders religion, renders Christianity unbelievable, irrational, actually true? You see, there's at first sight, there is a problem with the claim that they make. And that is the existence through history, at the founding of modern science and through to today, the existence of scientists, world-class scientists, who are also believers in God, if not Christians. So, for instance, Francis Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, Charles Babbage, Mendel, Pasteur, Kelvin, Clerk Maxwell. The stellar names of the history of science, all believers in God, if not Christians. And today there's people like Bob White, the professor of geophysics at Cambridge University, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, John Polkinghorne, the astrophysicist, all world-class scientists, all believers in Christianity. I was sat next to a student just this last week, where I live in Cambridge, who had just been accepted into a biology PhD at Cambridge. Hundreds of Christian scientists who see no conflict between their Christianity and their science. It seems that, at least on face value, there is a problem with this claim that science renders Christianity obsolete. But you might say, well, hang on a minute, that's just a list of names. Maybe these people just didn't think about it. Certainly the ones who kind of were around when science got going, well, when they were around, everyone was a Christian. Everyone at least had to say they were a Christian. That's what Richard Dawkins was saying. So it proves nothing to say that they believed in God. But the story's a little bit more complex than that. Alfred North Whitehead was a historian of the origins of science, how science developed. And he came to the conclusion that Christianity, the belief in a rational creator God, was actually the soil, the seedbed from which modern science sprung forth. C.S. Lewis summarised his conclusions like this. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. You see, the Christian worldview, the idea there is a rational mind behind the universe, far from being antithetical to science, was actually the thing that made science possible. Paul Davies, the astrophysicist, says this: it was from the intellectual ferment brought about by the merging of Greek philosophy and Judeo-Islamic Christian thought that modern science emerged, with its unidirectional linear time, its insistence on nature's rationality, and its emphasis on mathematical principles. And he goes on to say that science can only happen because we believe that the universe is not absurd, and that it is comprehensible to our minds. And therefore, he says, science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. So in terms of its origin, in terms of its basis, rather than there being a conflict between science and Christianity, in fact, Christianity is what gave science its start, gave science its opportunity to get going. Science flows out of the Christian belief in a rational God. Now, at this point, you might say, well, hang on a minute. If that's true, if there really is no conflict between science and Christianity, why is it that people like Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and Christopher Hitchens and so many others are constantly telling us that the claims of science render belief in God irrational? Why is there always a new book out telling us about how science undermines God? If Christianity and science are so compatible, as you claim, what's that all about? Well, I want to suggest that the clash is not between science and Christianity, but between two different worldviews, two different ways of observing what we see around us. Two philosophies, if you like. The idea that there is a rational creator, God who has made the world, made us, made everything that we see, the Christian view, or the atheist view, what we might call materialism, that all there is matter, motion, time and chance. That everything, when we boil it down, is just matter and energy. And what we have in the new atheist movement and so on is not the people who are just kind of on the side of science, but people who are advocating a particular worldview, a particular way of looking at the world. And so in the time we've got remaining, at a very kind of basic level, I just want to look at areas in which those two worldviews collide, the worldview of Christianity, the worldview of materialism, and ask you to think, which do you think offers a more plausible explanation of the world in which we live? Which do you think offers a more plausible explanation of the universe and human life? So three areas in which Christianity and materialism come into conflict. The first is the nature of the universe itself. One of the fruits of modern science, of modern physics in particular, is the way it's been able to reveal to us that the universe seems to be very, very finely tuned to make human life, complex life at all, possible. There are various different scientific, various different constants, various different things in the universe that have to be the way they are for the universe to sustain life like us. So one philosopher says the universe looks like a put-up job. This is how Francis Collins, the former head of the Human Genome Project, puts it. He says, altogether there are 15 physical constants whose values current theory is unable to predict. They're givens. They simply have to have the value that they have. This list includes the speed of light, the strength of the weak and strong nuclear forces, various parameters associated with electromagnetism, and the force of gravity. the chance that all of these constants would take on the values necessary to result in a stable universe capable of sustaining complex life forms is almost infinitesimal. And yet those are exactly the parameters that we observe. In sum, our universe is wildly improbable. Now, this idea that the parameters are very, very finely tuned is not a matter of scientific debate. It's a common ground between scientists of a Christian persuasion and an atheist persuasion. And of course, the Christian explanation for this is that the reason why the universe is so finely tuned is because it's the product of a rational, personal God who wants complex life forms between, like you and I, to exist, if we can be called complex life forms. That he's deliberately made the universe as it is, so that you and I could come into being. And that's the Christian explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, for the materialist, for the person that believes that all there is matter, motion, time, and chance, the fine-tuning of the universe does present a little bit more of a challenge. But what some of the thinkers from that philosophy have posited is perhaps we are not the only universe. Perhaps there is an infinite number of universes, all with various different parameters. And we just happen to be in the universe that's able to sustain complex life. It's sometimes called a world ensemble, or the multiverse, or M theory. And Stephen Hawking and his co-author Leonard Mlodinow put that forward as an argument in a recent book called The Grand Design. But this is what a scientific journalist called Michael Turner wrote in a review of that book in Nature magazine. He said this: "The multiverse is possibly the most important idea of our time, and may even be right, but it gives me a headache. Is it science if we cannot test it? The different universes are incommunicado, so we will never be able to observe them. The multiverse displaces rather than answers the question about choice and who chooses, and does not explain why there is something rather than nothing. It begs the question of why there is space, time, and M theory at all." There's a couple of points to make about it. First of all, do you notice that Turner says quite rightly there's no data from these other universes. Hawking and Mlodinow don't make the claim because they've read off the data from some kind of experiment. But the multiverse theory is a faith position. It's an explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe, not based on experimental data, but that flows out of a philosophical commitment to the materialist worldview. Both the idea that this universe is the product of a rational creator and the idea that there's an infinite number of universes are faith positions. But also, even if the multiverse theory is true, and it may be, there's still lots of other questions that materialists would have to answer about why there is space, time, and where all these infinite number of universes came from. And even if you get around the fine-tuning of the universe and the way it seems to be finely tuned for the existence of life, there are still further questions about the way this universe operates that I think we have to look at. For instance, the way in which our minds and reality and mathematics seem to be aligned in a way that enables us to have real data about the world. For instance, Albert Einstein formulated his theory of relativity not by doing all sorts of experiments, but by just simply working out some mathematical equations. And Einstein said this: he said, at some point an enigma presents itself which in all ages has agitated inquiring minds. How can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate to the objects of reality? Einstein asked the question, why is it I can do maths, I can just think stuff abstractly and do the maths and just follow the laws of mathematics and logic. And then I turn to the universe and I find that through that maths, I've actually discovered something about the way the universe works. What's the explanation of that? If the universe is just the cause of blind physical forces, matter, motion, time and chance, which worldview, Christianity and a rational personal creator God, or atheism and materialism, offers the best explanation of the universe that we live in? That's the first area. The second area is human life itself, human life. What are the implications for living as a human being if we adopt the two philosophies, either of Christianity or of materialism? For instance, what about the area of morality? We all instinctively have kind of moral intuitions that some things are right, some things are wrong. But does that fit with materialism? This is how one materialist, Francis Crick, who helped discover the DNA double helix, this is his explanation of human life. He says, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Richard Dawkins has called us chunks of rock-sized matter. The question is, if that is true, what does it do to our moral intuitions? If I am just a chunk of rock-sized matter in ultimately chemicals arranged in a certain way, which themselves are just atoms arranged in a certain way, and this lectern is a sort of lectern-sized chunk of matter, chemicals arranged in a certain way, atoms arranged in a certain way, is there fundamentally any difference, if those two things are true, between chopping this lectern in half and chopping me in half? Now, if you chop me in half, my wife and my mother and one or two other people will be slightly upset. That's I think, fair to say. But then if you chop this lectern in half, you'll upset the chaplaincy and probably the CU, who probably promised the chaplaincy that no lecterns will get chopped in half during the course of this event. So you're going to upset people either way. And yet instinctively we believe, I hope we believe anyway, that chopping me in half, or chopping any of you in half, would be a more serious matter than chopping this lectern in half. But why is that? If ultimately and fundamentally the lectern is just chemicals and I'm just chemicals, the lectern is just atoms and I'm just atoms. Now I'm not saying that atheists believe that chopping people in half is okay. In fact, my point is exactly the opposite. My question is, why don't atheists believe that that is the case? Because very, very few of them do. But on the basis of their own view of the universe, you think that would be the natural conclusion. Or think about the issue of love. Richard Dawkins says that love is just kind of brain stuff. It's just the product of chemical reactions in your mind. Is that right? I remember the night before I got married, we had our wedding rehearsal, and for the first time ever, I said the wedding vows looking my wife in the eye. And I had to stop several times because I was choking up. She got through them fine. I was a blubbering mess. Because I suddenly felt the emotional force of what I was going to say that next day. Or I remember when my son was born, holding him in my arms the first time, looking into his eyes. Is that just brain stuff? Can we really live consistently with that? This is what Matthew Said, the Times journalist, said. Love, Shakespeare tells us, is a smoke raised with the fume of sighs, a madness most discreet, a choking gall, and a preserving sweet. It's a fair point. But would he have written it if he'd known that love is really an epiphenomenon created by mindless replicators whose preservation is the ultimate rationale for our existence? It doesn't seem to have quite the same ring, does it? Now, I'm not saying that people who are materialists, people who are atheists, don't fall in love, don't have any moral intuitions. That's clearly not the case. My question is, can any of us live consistently with the idea that all we are chunks of rock-sized matter. And if we can't live consistently with it, doesn't that raise a very large question mark about whether those convictions, those ideas about human life, really are true? So, first of all, the nature of the universe. Secondly, human life. But thirdly and finally, very briefly, the third area where these two worldviews come into conflict is the question of the claims of Jesus. Now, at this point, you might think, you've been relatively interesting so far, but now you have to bring Jesus into it. This is very tedious, very boring. Why bring up an obscure religious figure at this point? Well, the reason is because if the question is, does God exist, then the claims of Jesus Christ have an awful lot to say about that question. You remember that, you probably don't remember, but in that review of Hawking's grand design, the journalist Michael Turner says the problem with the multiverse theory is that the other universes outside our own are incommunicado. There's no data to go on about whether or not they exist. And you may say the same about God. God has left himself incommunicado. There's no data to go on. There's no data to look at to see whether he exists. But the Christian claim is that is not the case. The Christian claim is that God is not incommunicado, that he's communicated to us through coming into the world as a man like Jesus. This is how one of Jesus' earliest followers puts it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. The Greek word there, word, is logos. It meant the rational principles behind the universe. The thing that means that mathematics works and maps onto reality. And then John goes on to say this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son. John is saying the one who created the universe, who wrote the laws of physics, has stepped into this universe as a human being. And that has two crucial implications. The first is that it means we can look at the claims of Jesus through the lens of history. On your chairs are these booklets, an eyewitness account of the life of Jesus, evidence of what he said and did, that you can scrutinise, you can look into. There's going to be a course on next Monday called Uncover Cafe for you to look at. You can sign up for it on the white bits of paper on your table, for you to scrutinise, because God has made himself accessible to the tools of history by stepping into it. But secondly, the second implication is that if God has revealed himself as a person, as Jesus, it means that the question of what is behind the universe, the question of whether or not God exists, is no longer some abstract philosophical point, but it's a personal one. Because if God has stepped into history as a person, then he wants to have a relationship with you. He wants to know you personally. The implications of that are astounding. And I wonder whether you'll look at the life and the claims of Jesus and see whether or not that extraordinary thought that there might be a personal God who wants to know you is actually true. Now, I'm sure there'll be lots of things that I've said that were unclear, that you weren't sure about, that you vehemently disagreed about, that you want to ask a question about. There's going to be time for questions in a moment. Ed's just going to come up and say a little bit about what's happening, and then I'll try and answer as many questions as I can.